Now, bringing in our next guest, big news this week. Over in the U.S., there was news that a CIA whistleblower revealed that the CIA pressured people who had been saying that COVID came from a lab to change their tune. Meanwhile, here in Australia, we've got the government planning a misinformation bill that would punish social media platforms and individual citizens if a bureaucrat said something they didn't like. Joining us to discuss all of this now, Stanford University professor Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration during the pandemic, which said that lockdowns, broad-based lockdowns, would be a disaster. He was proven right, but what he said was called misinformation at the time. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, thanks so much for coming back on Outsiders. It seems, Jay, like the fight over COVID and the pandemic and misinformation, it ain't won yet, is it?
It really isn't. It's been shocking to see during the pandemic the government use its raw power in the United States, and I think in Australia as well, to suppress criticism, honest criticism of its own policies, citing the idea of misinformation. It would use its power to tell social media companies what to censor and who to censor. All this has come out in a federal lawsuit that's now going to the Supreme Court. The federal court, district court, actually ruled in our favor, documenting exactly what I just said. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not. And what we see is a government that used its raw power in a way that it never should be using in a free society. We have the right to free speech for a reason, so that we can criticize the government when it got it wrong. And the government essentially said we shouldn't have that power during the pandemic.
Dr. Jay, you've got this instance here where we've got the allegation that CIA investigators were effectively paid to find that they weren't sure where the virus had come from. What does news like this do for faith in public institutions, and how does that bode for the future of Western culture?
Well, it certainly makes you question what exactly was the government doing before the pandemic. I mean, there are pretty solid reasons to think that this virus may have been a result of laboratory experiments. Laboratory experiments been sponsored by the United States government and also done in China. What was the CIA's role? What role did they have? Why was there any interest in covering up that fact? Why would there, and if this allegation is correct, that the CIA actually paid off its own analysts to not tell the public, or at least not even to tell the president that the CIA thought that the virus was as a result of a laboratory work. I mean, it's just shocking. I think this is something that the entire world deserves to know. We need absolute transparency in this. This is not a question of national security anymore. This is a question of human rights. It's a question of honesty. How can you trust the scientific establishment or any government that acts in this way and then uses its raw power to suppress criticism of itself by violating free speech rights?
Liz.
Indeed. Dr. Jay, can I get your thoughts on why you think that they did pay off the CIA? The CIA were trying to suppress this idea that it was a lab leak. Obviously, it was a very popular theory at the time. We couldn't put any bones to the body of it, etc., and so on. But to now find out that it was suppressed, why do you think that was? Was it because they didn't want people finding out that there was US-funded gain-of-function research going on there? Was it because they didn't want people then to start asking, was this leak a mistake or not? Or was it, as we were also told at some points throughout the pandemic, it's because we don't want a rise in racism sentiment towards the Chinese?
I mean, I think the first two explanations are certainly live and possible. I think the third is laughable. In what sense would you say that a story that says that the virus came out of strange cultural practices by the Chinese, that's not racist, but that it came out of this sophisticated laboratory work by the Chinese, that's racist? That made no sense. It never made sense at the time. I don't know for certain what is motivating this. I'll tell you, this kind of research has dual use, right? There's both potential military uses for this and potential civilian uses for this for pandemic prevention. And if it's dual use and it resulted in a huge epidemic, a huge pandemic that we've seen, that we actually caused it, well, it's going to be very embarrassing both for any entity that sponsored it, including potentially the CIA or the U.S. government. Now, I don't have access to classified information. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but what does look like is there's a cover-up. And it's a cover-up that nobody deserves. We need to know the truth so that we can take steps so that it never happens again.
And Jay, we know that from the Twitter files and the revelations that came out after Elon Musk took after Twitter, now X.com, that you were one of the people who was deliberately censored, we think probably at the behest of different government officials, by Twitter, which had a very cozy relationship with the White House, with the FBI, with all the alphabet agencies. Your Great Barrington Declaration, which predicted so much of the harm that we've seen educationally, economically, as a result of mass lockdowns, rather targeted protection, that was all proved right, but it was censored. Now, here in Australia, I want your reaction as a scientist to this idea that they're going to try and censor misinformation, or what a bureaucrat says is misinformation, finding both individuals and social media platforms. It seems to me this would be a very dangerous thing for scientific discovery.
It's dangerous for science and it's dangerous for the public. I mean, I think that the key thing to remember is that government does not have a monopoly on the truth. No scientist does, no person does. And certainly having the government hold in its hands the capacity, the supposed capacity to distinguish truth from untruth, and then to suppress anyone that criticizes it, is ripe for abuse. Essentially, it's saying to the government, you can suppress anyone that criticizes the government. How can you have a democracy like that? And for science, it is, you're absolutely right. It's the death and end of science. Science depends on the capacity, the freedom for scientists to disagree with scientific ideas that are popular, because that's how you generate hypotheses. That's how you cause people to do experiments. That's how science progresses. And so to have the government take on itself the power to say, oh, if you question the science, you are spreading misinformation, that essentially means the end of the science. It's like the dark age. You don't have I didn't think when I entered science that you would have a high pope of science that could tell you, oh, no, you can't think that, you can't test that. That's exactly the age we're entering. It's a return of a dark age.
James.
Dr. Jay, you know, we've always prided ourselves in the Western world that we have free speech. And yet in the last few years, we've seen the former Prime Minister of New Zealand say they are the sole source of truth. We've seen the Biden administration lean on Twitter, as my colleague said. Here in Australia, we've now got our government proposing misinformation and disinformation laws. I just want to get your thoughts on where has all this come from? It seems to me all of a sudden the Western governments have wanted to clamp down on free speech. It's not just about COVID, because the pandemic is over, but they continue to do this. What's going on in Western culture?
I think there's creeping authoritarianism. I think that people have discovered, governments have discovered, that the social media and the widespread interconnectedness of people through the internet gives them a way to control the conversation, to propagandize the population, even with the population knowing it, in ways that were unimaginable just a few years ago. And I think what's happening is that governments and political parties are trying to essentially solidify their power by taking on themselves this mantle of misinformation, scaring the living daylights out of the public, saying, "Oh, you're being subject to foreign propaganda." When in fact, what's happening is that governments, Western governments themselves, are engaging in propagandizing their own people. And again, this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but I'll tell you, the federal court that heard the Missouri versus Biden case, where I'm a plaintiff, confirmed that a number of federal agencies and the U.S. White House itself engaged in suppression of true things on the internet and on social media, because those true facts harmed the positions that the Biden administration was taking. This is not going to stop until the people say no.
And I mean, even beyond that, though, just from a scientific point of view, and also a political point of view, do you see that there's a real danger that if you start to suppress ideas that the government doesn't like, that what's going to wind up happening is that bad ideas will actually fester? Louis Brandeis, the famous Supreme Court justice, said that sunlight is the best disinfectant, i.e., if there are neo-Nazis or if there are crazy flat earthers or whatever out there, expose them, let people see them, and, their ideas will be shouted down. The potential, do you see a potential that actually more bad ideas makes it into the ecosystem of ideas if you wind up trying to crack down on them?
I mean, I think let's take a look at this from a public health point of view, right? You want the public health authorities to be able to tell the public, smoking is terrible for you. It causes cancer, and people to believe them. Well, and then if other people go around spreading misinformation about smoking, the key thing is that the public health authority has to be trustworthy. People actually have to trust it. If people trust it, then there's no problem. Other people can go around saying crazy things, but then the people will look to the public health authorities and say, oh yeah, smoking is bad for you. The problem now is that public health and so much of government has thrown away the trust of the public by telling noble lies during the pandemic about masking and a whole bunch of other things. And as a result of that, the lack of trustworthiness, that's when misinformation spreads without a counter. The public health authorities threw away the trust that they used to have, and that's the problem. And they're trying to fix it by suppressing misinformation online, when in fact the source of much misinformation during the pandemic was public health authorities itself. No, the right answer is just let people talk to each other, and exactly what you said will happen. People will correct it. The truth will come out over time. That's always what happens.
Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, you're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. And a very important point you make about public health and the death of trust. And God help us if there's another public health emergency. Thank you so much for your time, Jay Bhattacharya.